Okay, we're talking about scope of work in the minerals appraisal. Little housekeeping before we get into the meat of it. To define an appraisal is a thought process, and the report is the conveyance of that thought process. So in standards that are written, they're separate. They're separate issues. So it's one of those things that you need to be aware of. We also want to understand in the scope of work that we want to communicate with the client, because the client doesn't always tell us what we really want to know. They've got one concept, we've got another, and we need to be able to communicate a little bit better with them. We need to be prepared to ask them what they need versus what they're asking for. Listen to what their key points of their needs. Can the work product be scaled better to fit their needs, such as consulting versus a full appraisal on the property? So it's just a matter of communicating better with the client. And a part of that, of course, is developing a scope of work. Scope of work is both found in the USPAP, the Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice, and IVS, the International Valuation Standards. They will be similar in IVS after this next update. There's a change undergoing, and so the two will be somewhat similar. With this paper, we're looking at just the USPAP portion. They've got a specific rule, and that rule is the scope of work. It only applies to the development phase of an appraisal. Here again, that's the reason why we differentiate between the report and the appraisal. This is only the development of the appraisal, so the thought process. And it also goes with appraisal reviews and consulting assignments. Here again, the report is separate in USPAP. They define it as 3 separate reports: restricted use, summary, and self-contained. I just put that up for reference for this. The elephant in the room. We've got geology versus appraisal. They are both separate work products within the appraisal. The geology can have its own scope of work. It is developed separately. The appraisal, although, uses whatever work product that the geology relates to. So even though a lot of minerals appraisers like to think of it as one big appraisal, it really is 2 separate entities with 2 separate scopes of work. And of course, today we're talking about the appraisal portion, what you need to know about that. The scope of work rule has 3 main points: identify the problem to be solved, which is fairly reasonable, determine and perform the scope of work necessary to develop a credible assignment result, and disclose the scope of work in the report. Now, if you're a geologist, an engineer, you're used to these concepts of work, scope of work. The appraiser, however, has not been subjected to these types of information within their reporting. So it was somewhat new, it was somewhat hodgepodge, and therefore the standards, USPAP in particular, decided that it was best to move into this direction. The scope of work will affect the type and amount and detail of information that will be collected and reported. It's the degree to which the property is identified, the degree to which the property is inspected, including testing, the type and extent of data research, and the type and extent of analysis applied to arrive at opinions or conclusions. The significant 7. These are requirements that USPAP standards require of any appraisal that's developed. And these 7 lead the appraiser to the scope of work, because it identifies what needs to be done and intended for. So the client, the intended users, the intended use. In a lot of cases, that's a major decision. Type and opinion, type and definition of value. Value in itself can have many different types of definitions. So market value is only one of those definitions. There may be other definitions that you need to work with. So you need to identify that. The effective date. Is it prospective, retrospective, or is it on the date of inspection? So it's something that here again you need to communicate with your client. The relevant characteristics of the property. In the case of minerals properties, we can be dealing with personal property, real property, or business valuation. So we need to be able to understand the concepts of each of those types of appraisal. And lastly, we have assignment conditions. And we're going to give a little bit more on the assignment conditions because it can really trip you occasionally in developing the scope of work and the assignment. You may have limited access to the property. And I talked to many of our colleagues here that, saying that the owner won't allow us to investigate to the fullest extent. This is part of the problem. You may be able to work through it, but if there's a problem that you cannot develop a credible appraisal out of this, then you should decline the appraisal completely. You may also have limited sampling or testing of the property. Here again, you need to figure out whether you can use assumptions or hypothetical conditions that might be able to allow you to complete it. But if the client doesn't understand or really want those hypotheticals in their appraisal, then you're going to have to probably decline the assignment. Limited time to perform the work. This sometimes really becomes an issue. And the client has to understand that it takes time to research and develop and finally to write that report. So time is part of this consideration. Limited budget. Everybody, any appraiser who works in the field knows that you kind of throw a figure out there and you hope that you're right and you hope that you don't have to put a lot more time into it than what you've bid. But if the client, on the other hand, says, okay, I'm not going to pay your high fee, I will agree to a much lesser fee, then you can then agree to scale back your appraisal. But you have to understand the relationship to that, and you have to convey that to the client. And part of the scope of work is to report those limitations within the report. Degree of client's pre-existing knowledge of the property. If a client is well-versed in their property, this is for financial records or a due diligence to sell the property. They may be intimately knowledgeable of that property. They don't need a lot of additional wording to tell them what they already know about their property. So you can, part of the scope of work is that you can scale that back. You can say, the client is knowledgeable in the property. Will indicate the pertinent information that needs to be done. Everything else would be retained in the work file of the appraiser, not actually worked on in the reporting. One of the things about scope of work is, here again, it's on a scaled level. And this grid shows typically from the top, which would be the least amount of work going into each one of them areas, and increasing in magnitude. So property ID, you might inspect it or you may not inspect it. You may have a proposed mine plan or a professional survey, or you may have a complete mine plan in place that you can work from. So these are things to consider. Geology, here again, it's a separate work product, but you do have to consider it as part of the appraisal, obviously. So you have to at least understand what those levels of confidence that you have in the data. Market analysis here again. How well are you going to research the market? And and you go through the cost approach, the income approach, and the sales approach in order to do all of these. You may not do any of those approaches, but you may have progressive amounts of work involved in each. What constitutes an acceptable scope of work? Research and analysis to develop credible results, meets expectations of regular intended users. So if you have a bank that's a regular customer, it meets their expectations, or the appraiser's peers. So you gentlemen would be the peers of the appraiser. What you expect in an appraisal would be acceptable in the scope. Ongoing process in appraisal is the information or conditions discovered during the course of work might be a cause to reconsider the scope. Something might pop up. You're going to have to make some changes. Okay. I was told I had a little bit more time, so I was rushing, and now I got a little bit better handle on it. But you may have to reconsider the scope. You get into the project. The client, maybe the client doesn't understand or doesn't know certain situations, then you're going to have to work with them and say, look, we have to change the scope of work in order to make this appraisal a credible product. The appraiser must be prepared to support exclusion of any information, method, or technique that appears relevant. So if you suggest to the client that, say, the income approach is the most pertinent to your appraisal as a minerals appraisal, that's typical. But the client's saying, I just want the sales comparison approach. And you say, okay, here are the problems. And so you have to be able to then, after you write your report, you're going to have to be able to support that decision, and what the problems might be as a result of it. And there may be other situations too. But anytime that you exclude anything, be prepared. It's just like thinking of yourself as always going to court. If you go to court, the other side's going to grab a hold of it. They're going to ask you questions. Be prepared to respond. The appraiser must not allow conditions to limit the scope of work to such a degree that the work product would not be credible in the context of the intended user. Here again, the intended user is your end product. They need to understand. They need to receive a product that they can work with. It may not be to their liking as far as the end value goes, but at least you have developed the appraisal to the point that it's a logical conclusion of the appraisal value. It's still an opinion of value. You as the appraiser, it's your opinion, but you have gone through the steps in order to arrive at that opinion, and you can then become an advocate of your value. You must not allow the intended use of an assignment or client's objectives to cause the assignment results to be biased. This happens a lot in court cases where one side is an advocate of the client and not the value that they should be developing. So as a result, you have clashes. It's one thing to have differing opinions and techniques and opinions of relevance to the appraisal. It's another thing to be just outright, an advocate for your client and their wants and needs. If you'd like to learn a little bit more about the scope of work, and particularly the scope of work is the rule in USPAP. There's a book at called Scope of Work by Stephanie Coleman, MAISRA, with the Appraisal Institute. You can either log on to the Appraisal Institute and purchase it out of their bookstore, or I've shown you here on where you can go online and purchase it as ebooks. It's a pretty good reference. Any questions?